Alrighty, so we are wrapping up chapter 26 with the Reagan Revolution. So just to kind of recap, neoconservatism, just the highlights. They believed that the free world needed to arm itself morally as well as militarily, and that a common enemy was needed. Hence, communism abroad, but big government domestically. So two bad things, communism and big government. Those were the things they were against. Government was okay if it was helping you curb bad behavior. So, for example, um, well, the sentence below this, men and women needed to lead virtuous lives, or governmental action needed to force them to do so. So it was okay for the government to step in and say, you don't need to I don't know, smoke crack, um, or sleep with prostitutes, or I don't know, whatever. But if you're telling people how they can, live their life, then that's a problem. Neoconservatives spoke the language of tradition, community, and moral commitment. Libertarian conservatives spoke about the language of progress and personal autonomy, that you are allowed to be your own person and the government shouldn't be able to tell you what you can and cannot do. So towards the end of the 70s, we have the rise of what we call the religious right. And this is encompassed in the moral majority under Jerry Falwell. That there's this idea of quote unquote family values promoting a traditional vision of family life. That you have a mother, you have a father, the mother stays at home, takes care of the kids, the father makes the money, everybody goes to church, and la ti da. Opposition to media outlets that it claimed promote an anti-family agenda. So this is about making networks have wholesome TV shows that, the news isn't focusing on, this kind of immoral lifestyle. You had opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. And interestingly enough, opposition to the SALT treaties, SALT 1 and SALT 2. Opposition to state recognition or acceptance of homosexual acts. Prohibition of abortion, even in cases of incest, rape, or in pregnancies where the life of the mother is at stake. Their support for Christian prayer in schools. Marketing to Jews and other non-Christians for conversion to conservative Christianity. So this is really what is encompassed in the religious right, and some of these things should ring a bell because we have very similar situations that we're dealing with today. I don't think so much about obviously the limitation of arms, but there is the push for more military spending, and all the others kind of fit in kind of a modern tradition. So the battle over the Equal Rights Amendment, and there's a source that you're going to be reading in your primary sources. The ERA goes back to the 1920s, and this was right after the election of 1920 when women gained the right to vote. There was this push for an Equal Rights Amendment. It actually is approved by Congress in 1972, and then the amendment heads to the heads to the states. Phyllis Schlafly, I think is her name, is pictured in the bottom down here. This is her. She led the fight in a number of different states for rejecting the ERA, which of course ended up happening, and largely on the argument that it would destroy American families and destroy the American way of life because it was encouraging women to no longer stay at home but become more like men and go out and work and forget about their job at home. And you'll read more about her in your primary sources. But the anti-ERA movement actually does win, and many of the states reject the amendment to the point that it never does pass. Of course, the abortion issue is a hot topic even today, but it mobilizes the evangelical Christian demographic based on the supposed acceptance of politicians of sexual immorality at the expense of moral values. The Catholic Church was largely responsible for the initial push against abortion. And of course, Catholic Church still today, I think, opposes birth control. But of course, abortion is still a very hot topic among Catholics. But evangelicals pick up and join in on this as well. And their basis is that life begins at conception and that abortion is murder. Feminists, of course, challenge it because they argue that women have the right to control their body, including the right to a safe and illegal abortion. And many people argue that banning abortion does not end abortions. It means that abortions now become back alley abortions where they are unsafe, that women can die because of there is no regulation of the abortion clinics because they're outlawed. And so there's the health concern as well. First major win for anti-abortionists in 1976, Congress overrides Ford's veto on a law ending federal funding for abortions for poor women through Medicaid. The tax revolt, this is something that we still have today, is that people want to limit the amount of taxes. Sounds kind of stupid, but there was a time when people would pay taxes because they believed that it was their right or their job as a citizen. But what's behind the tax revolt, and it starts in California with Proposition 13, where they vote to limit the increase of property taxes. What's behind the lower tax push is that lower taxes boosted business profits and therefore energized the economy, gave more money. It's kind of a trickle-down economic system where it energized the economy and it reduced the resources available to government. And so in a roundabout way, it's reducing government's reach and regulation. And so many conservatives bought into the tax revolt strictly because it means that government is going to be smaller and not as large. In the West, you have what they call the Sagebrush Rebellion, which was the conservative movement to open up federal land. And the map on the right shows you the federal land. I guess it's as of right now, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, a lot of land in the West was seized by the American government. A lot of it was conservation land, but it also might be mining and livestock and all that kind of stuff. But members of this movement wanted the federal lands to transfer ownership to the state and local governments so that they could be used for mineral extraction, livestock grazing, and other economic development. This is still an issue today. If you are paying attention to what's going on in Congress, President Trump has taken a large number of national parks and national historic sites within the West and taken portions of the land and given them back to the states. And it's drawn a lot of criticism because there are some people that are arguing that this land should have been conserved for historic or environmental concerns. But this is really where that kind of begins. So Ronald Reagan begins as governor of California in 1966, and he gets elected under two main tenets: sending the welfare bums back to work and clean up the mess at Berkeley. Berkeley is at the University of California, and this is where the free speech movement originated. And so he basically is trying to put down these student demonstrations. And at one point, there's a case where they call it Bloody Thursday, where you had one one person killed, I believe it was a student, and then about 111 police officers were injured. Um, he does sign an abortion bill as governor to prevent unsafe abortions, but later he says that he shouldn't have signed it, and becomes an avid pro-life advocate. So the election of 1980, you have the Republican ticket with Ronald Reagan, and George Herbert Walker Bush. And then the Democratic ticket, of course, is Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale. Carter essentially wins. I'm sorry, Reagan wins hands over. 489 electoral votes to 49 for Carter. Um, the popular vote actually was a little bit closer, which is kind of interesting. But certainly, Jimmy Carter, as I mentioned, had a very negative public opinion, so that kind of helped Reagan quite a bit. Under the Reagan Revolution, you have tax reform. In 1981, you have the Economic Tax Recovery Act, which Congress reduced the top tax rate from 70% to 50%. 2 years later, the Tax Reform Act reduced that percentage to 28%. And this was the largest tax cut in the nation's history, and it, of course, benefited the wealthy and the corporations. Um, you also had deep cuts into social and cultural programs in 1981 under the Omnibus Reconciliation Act. You also had regulatory cuts. Reagan appointed heads of regulatory agencies that would be cutting back on environmental and workplace safety rules. Again, this is something that Trump has done quite a bit. It seems he's put a lot of people into leadership positions within the departments, with the idea that they would basically kind of deconstruct the departments. I'm thinking like the Department of Energy. He had Perry, who was in charge of the Department of Energy, I believe, who was very much opposed to the Department of Energy. And so obviously these people are going to come in and they're going to start cutting back on the regulations that have been put into place over the years. Supply side economics or trickle down economics relied upon high interest rates to curb inflation and lower tax rates, especially for high income businesses and Americans and businesses, to stimulate private investment. Also, the policy assumed that by cutting taxes, Americans at all levels of society would work harder, since more of their paycheck went to them and not to the government, which seems logical. Reagan was very hostile to organized labor. In August of 1981, the air traffic controllers go on strike. And rather than try to work with the union, Reagan just fired them all, had the military cover the air traffic control system, and hired new employees that I can guarantee you were not unionized. Manufacturing jobs continue to decline, and you start seeing the picture at the bottom right. Union membership continues to decline. What's interesting about this is this chart over here, the real average weekly wages between 1955 and 1990. Certainly you start seeing a decline in wages. This is for working class, not for the wealthy, obviously. The declining of the middle class since the 1980s, so 1974 it shows, and the middle class is on a decline since then. Pre-tax income between 1962 and 2014. You can see for the top 1%, it's on the rise. For the bottom 50%, it's on the decline. Something else I was trying to think. Interestingly, how this shows the top 1% is again on an incline with after-tax income, and the bottom 50% is still on the decline. Okay. Keep going. The Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation He deregulates the savings and loan associations, allowing them to invest in some kind of shady ventures and dealings, and they end up going bankrupt. And so the federal government ends up paying around $250 billion to bail out the Savings and Loan Corporation. Kind of like what happens in 2008, but not as widespread. It's just in that one particular division. Deficit spending, the federal spending far exceeded income, producing some of the largest budget deficits in history. The national debt tripled to 2.7 trillion, which I think it's getting up there now, or maybe exceeded that. But in 1984, Reagan easily wins re-election over Walter Mondale and his running mate Geraldine Ferraro. Ferraro was the first female candidate on a national ticket. So this is kind of what Reaganomics did. These were what Reagan pledged to do was cut the growth of government spending, cut both income taxes and capital gains tax, cut the regulations on businesses, and cut the expansion of the money supply. So cutting inflation, cutting taxes and capital gains, and cutting some of the regulations and government spending in order to make government smaller. So some of the criticisms of Reagan, of the Reagan Revolution, conservatives kept most, conservatives were critical of Reagan because he kept most of the core elements of the welfare state in place, like Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. Remember, this has been a source of contention since they began. So Social Security, since the New Deal, has always been something that most conservatives would put on the cutting block. Medicaid and Medicare is another, or two other programs like that as well. Conservatives said abortion remained legal under Reagan's presidency, so obviously he didn't do what he was supposed to do. Women continued to join the workforce in unprecedented numbers, contrary to the traditional roles of women. Sandra Day O'Connor was nominated to the Supreme Court by Reagan, and many conservatives saw that as a negative. One victory for conservatives was the case Bowers versus Hardwick, with the Supreme Court upholding the constitutionality of state laws outlawing homosexual acts. And we talked about that in the 1960s, that it was actually, and I may have said this was, I don't know what I said, but anyway, this was a win for conservatives, not a win for LGBTQ advocates, that the Supreme Court does actually support the constitutionality of these laws banning homosexuality and acts. In 1984, Congress had banned military aid to the Contras fighting in Nicaragua, and Reagan secretly authorized the sale of arms to Iran in 1985 in order to get American hostages held by Islamic groups in the Middle East. Basically, it was a system. His CIA director, William Casey, and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North set up a system to divert money to buy arms for the Contras in defiance of the congressional ban. And so it was this like triangle going on where they were selling arms to Iran. That money went to buy more arms for the Contras. The story was leaked in 1987, and 11 members of the administration were convicted of perjury or pled guilty before being tried. And this made Oliver North really a very popular figure. He actually made it on a couple of television shows as like a cameo. But I think he just served as the head of the NRA, and I think he's been replaced now. He's no longer the head of the NRA, but the National Rifle Association. But that's been pretty recent. The other criticism of Reagan involves AIDS. And this is a touchy subject. because really it takes the Reagan administration quite a long time to acknowledge that this is a problem. And a lot of this had to do with the prejudice around homosexuality. The Reagans, being that Reagan was an actor in Hollywood, had been friends with Rock Hudson for quite a while. And when Rock Hudson comes out as having AIDS, when that story breaks, the Reagans cut off any communication and contact with him. And prior to that, they had been very, very close. And so, as the deaths mount between 1981 and 1985, you can see it really, really starts to expand. Many people felt that this was a gay plague, that it was not going to hit the heterosexual population, and that, as some people believed, it was killing the right people. On September 17, 1985, Reagan actually says the word AIDS for the first time after over 10,000 people had died from AIDS. And it was in his second term as president. And there's actually a clip, you can Google it on YouTube, where they joke about AIDS. And so Reagan's presidency is not one that many LGBTQ or the members of that community really find supportive. He doesn't actually give an AIDS-centered speech until 1987, after over 20,000 Americans had died. Once AIDS moves into the heterosexual population, things change very quickly. We've made a great deal of strides, but for many gays and lesbians within the community during the 80s, this was seen as really the time of tremendous loss. There are many people who literally went to funerals every day for several months, friends who died from AIDS, and there was really nothing that anybody could do. If you are interested in this sort of thing, there's a movie called And the Band Played On, and also Angels in America, which is a series that HBO did about AIDS. Very powerful stuff, but certainly something that we will be, in recent years, Reagan has been getting a lot more of a negative reputation, largely because of how he fails to even treat the AIDS issue. And I mentioned before about Mikhail Gorbachev. He becomes the general secretary of the Communist Party in 1985, and it goes until 1991. But he opens up the Soviet Union to a great deal of reform. He calls it glasnost, which was openness and freedoms, and this was more of a social reform. And then perestroika was more of an economic restructuring. And so they're injecting a little bit of capitalism into the Eastern Bloc. Some of his foreign policy reforms, equality within the Eastern Bloc countries, with no use of force. So rather than the Soviets, like we saw in the Prague Spring, coming in with military crushing the student demonstrations, they tried to work with the government of that particular country and solve that issue that way. There's greater freedoms and independence. There are arms reduction talks with Reagan. Gorbachev cuts military spending by 50%, and then in 1989, he orders a withdrawal from Afghanistan. So a great deal of change within the Soviet sphere. And Reagan in the Cold War. Reagan came into the presidency vowing to end what he called the Vietnam Syndrome, committing forces to overseas conflict. However, he seems to quickly forget that, because if you look at the maps at the bottom, all of these were where Reagan sent in the military. And of course, as we've mentioned, all of this military spending is driving up the federal deficit. So in 1988, Reagan leaves office, and you have the election of George Herbert Walker Bush and Dan Quayle to the presidency and vice presidency. The Democratic ticket is Michael Dukakis as president and Lloyd Bentsen as vice president. There's some funny stuff on Saturday Night Live if you want to go back and watch YouTube. But anyway, George Bush does win, and this is really what he rides in on are the coattails of Reagan. That the bumper stickers and buttons and everything were calling for keeping the Republican or the Reagan Revolution going.